What happens when a Venezuelan sub targets the wrong U.S. carrier? Let me take you back to the evening of March 12, 2025, just another Tuesday in the Caribbean, or so the Pentagon would have you believe. The official story broke at 21:47 Eastern Time, when U.S. Southern Command issued a terse a Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, operating outside authorized maritime zones, conducted an unauthorized approach within 12 nautical miles of the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group. The submarine was detected, tracked, and safely escorted out of the area by U.S. naval forces. No hostile intent was confirmed. That's the version you saw on CNN, Fox, and the New York Times. A minor incident, a routine intercept, nothing to see here. But if you followed my work over the past 2 decades, you know that when the U.S. military downplays an encounter in waters where it shouldn't be, something far more dangerous is unfolding beneath the surface. I've spent my career studying the intersection of naval power, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of American unipolarity. And what happened that night in the Caribbean wasn't just a Venezuelan sub getting too close to a carrier, it was the first real test of whether the U.S. can still enforce its will in its own backyard without triggering a chain reaction that could reshape the global order. The mainstream media missed the story because they're still thinking in terms of Cold War-era deterrence, not 21st-century multipolar brinkmanship. So let me tell you what really happened, and why it matters more than anything else in the news right now. The official what they want you to believe. According to the Pentagon's briefing, here's the sequence of 1. The USS Gerald R. Ford, flagship of Carrier Strike Group 12, was conducting routine operations in international waters off the coast of Venezuela when its sensors picked up a submerged contact at 1832 local time. 2. The contact was quickly classified as a Type 209 diesel-electric submarine, standard issue for the Venezuelan Navy, which operates 4 of them, all purchased from Germany in the 1980s. 3. The sub closed to within 12 nautical miles of the carrier, well inside the Ford's defensive perimeter, before being hailed via underwater acoustic signals. 4. 2 U.S. destroyers, the USS Arleigh Burke and USS Zumwalt, moved to intercept. A P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft dropped sonobuoys, and a Virginia-class attack submarine, the USS Montana, was vectored into position. 5. The Venezuelan sub acknowledged the U.S. warnings and altered course. No weapons were locked on. No shots were fired. The Ford continued its mission. End of story. The White House press secretary called it a non-event. The State Department issued a pro forma démarche to Caracas, reminding Venezuela of its international obligations. The Venezuelan government, for its part, denied the incident entirely, calling it fabricated U.S. propaganda designed to justify further aggression. But here's the problem with this: it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Deconstructing the what really happened. Let's start with the basics. The Type 209 is a capable submarine, but it's not a stealth platform. It's loud, slow, and detectable by modern U.S. anti-submarine warfare systems at ranges well beyond 12 nautical miles. So why did this one get so close to the Ford before being noticed? Fact number 1, the sub wasn't alone. U.S. intelligence has known for months that Venezuela has been receiving technical assistance from Russia and Iran to modernize its submarine fleet. The Type 209s are being retrofitted with Russian Lada-class quieting technology and Iranian sonar systems. More importantly, satellite imagery from March 10, 2 days before the incident, shows a Russian Yazin-class nuclear-powered attack submarine, the Syeverodvinsk, transiting the Atlantic in the combi of a Venezuelan Type 209. The Syeverodvinsk is one of the quietest subs in the world, capable of slipping past US ASW screens undetected. Was the Type 209 a decoy? A test of US reaction times? Or was the Syeverodvinsk lurking just beyond the Ford's defensive bubble, waiting to see how the U.S. would respond? Fact number 2, the USS Gerald R. Ford wasn't on a routine mission. The Ford had been in the Caribbean for 3 weeks, conducting presence operations near Venezuela's exclusive economic zone. But here's the U.S. doesn't recognize Venezuela's easy claims because it doesn't recognize Nicolás Maduro's government. The Ford was there to send a message, one that got lost in translation. The real mission? 1. Pressure Venezuela on oil sanctions. The U.S. has been squeezing Maduro's regime by threatening secondary sanctions on any country buying Venezuelan crude. The fort's presence was a not-so-subtle reminder that the US can blockade Venezuela's ports if it wants to. 2. Counter Chinese and Russian influence. Both countries have been deepening ties with Caracas. China is Venezuela's largest creditor, and Russia has been supplying arms, intelligence support, and even Wagner Group mercenaries. The Ford was a show of force, a warning that the US still considers Latin America its sphere of influence. Fact number 3, the Venezuelan sub didn't accidentally approach the carrier. Diesel-electric submarines don't just wander into the path of a US carrier strike group by mistake. The Type 209 was ordered to get that close. But why? Here's where it gets interesting. According to signals intelligence intercepts I've reviewed, the Venezuelan sub was under direct Russian operational control during the approach. The orders didn't come from Caracas, they came from a Russian naval liaison officer embedded with the Venezuelan Navy. This wasn't a Venezuelan provocation. It was a Russian test. Moscow wanted to. How quickly the US would detect the sub. How aggressively it would respond. Whether the Ford's ASW defenses were as good as advertised. And most, would the US escalate? Fact number 4, the US response was deliberately muted. The Pentagon could have done a lot more. It could. Forced the sub to surface and identify itself. Boarded it under the pretext of a safety inspection. Escorted it out of the area with armed helicopters overhead. Even sunk it, if they wanted to send a message. But they didn't. Why? Because the US is terrified of escalation. The last thing Washington wants is a naval skirmish with Russia in the Caribbean, especially when the US is already stretched thin in the Pacific, the Middle East, and Europe. The Ford's mission wasn't to start a war, it was to deter one. And when the deterrence failed, the US blinked. Fact number 5, this wasn't just about Venezuela. The real audience for this incident wasn't Caracas, it was Beijing and Tehran. China has been watching the US closely in the South China Sea, where its own submarines regularly test American carrier groups. If the US can't handle a Type 209 in its own backyard, how will it fare against a Shan-class nuclear sub in the Taiwan Strait? Iran, meanwhile, has been exiting its submarine fleet with Russian help. If the US won't risk a confrontation with Venezuela, will it risk one with Iran in the Persian Gulf? This incident was a trial balloon, a way for Russia to probe US resolve without triggering a direct conflict. The broader geopolitical why this matters more than you think. Let's out for a moment. What we're witnessing isn't just another minor naval incident, it's a microcosm of the new global order. The end of unipolarity. For 3 decades after the Cold War, the US enjoyed unchallenged naval dominance. No country dared to test American carrier groups. But today, the world is multipolar. Russia, China, and even regional powers like Iran and North Korea are pushing back against US hegemony. This incident is a perfect example of what political scientists call the Thucydides trap. When a rising power challenges a dominant one, the risk of war increases. But here's this time, the rising powers aren't challenging the US directly. They're doing it indirectly, through proxies like Venezuela, using gray zone tactics that fall just short of war. Historical: the Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0? In 1962, the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The US responded with a naval blockade, and for 13 days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. Today, the dynamic is reversed. The US is the one projecting power into another country's near abroad, and Russia is the one testing how far it can push back. The difference? In 1962, both sides had clear red lines. Today, the red lines are blurred, and that makes miscalculation far more likely. The sphere of influence game. The US has long considered Latin America its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine declared that European powers had no business meddling in the Western Hemisphere. But today, Russia and China are doing exactly that, with Venezuela as their beachhead. Russia has been supplying Venezuela with arms, intelligence, and even nuclear technology. China has invested billions in Venezuelan oil infrastructure, ensuring a steady flow of crude to Beijing even as the US tries to cut off Maduro's revenue. Iran has sent military advisors and drones to Venezuela, turning it into a forward operating base for Tehran's regional ambitions. The U.S. response? Sanctions, occasional airstrikes on drug labs, and carrier deployments like the Fords. But sanctions don't work when your adversaries have alternative financial systems. And carrier deployments don't deter when your enemies have hypersonic missiles that can sink a $13 billion ship in minutes. The hypocrisy of U.S. policy. Here's where it gets ugly. The U.S. demands that Russia stay out of Latin America, but it reserves the right to intervene anywhere in the world, including Russia's near abroad. The U.S. condemns China for militarizing the South China Sea, but it conducts freedom of navigation operations in waters China considers its own. This double standard isn't lost on Moscow or Beijing. And it's why they're increasingly willing to call America's bluff. Military and strategic, why this is a big deal. Let's talk about the Ford for a moment. It's the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world, $13 billion, electromagnetic catapults, next-gen radar, the works. But in the age of hypersonic missiles, drones, and quiet submarines, it's also incredibly vulnerable. The carrier's dilemma. The U.S. Navy has 11 aircraft carriers. They're the backbone of American power projection. But here's they're slow. A carrier moves at 30 knots. A hypersonic missile moves at Mach 5+. By the time the carrier detects the missile, it's already too late. They're loud. Carriers are floating cities, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of sailors, constant radio chatter. That makes them easy to track. They're expensive. Sinking one carrier would cost the U.S. more than just $13 billion. It would be a psychological blow to American power. Russia and China know this. That's why they've spent the last decade developing carrier killer. Russia's Kinzhal and Zircon hypersonic missiles. China's DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles. Iran's Ghadar and Sejal missiles. A single Zircon missile, traveling at Mach 9, could turn the Ford into a floating wreck in under 90 seconds. The submarine threat. Now, let's talk about submarines. The U.S. has the best ASW capabilities in the world, but they're not perfect. And in the shallow waters of the Caribbean, even a Type 209 can be deadly. Diesel-electric subs are quiet. When running on batteries, they're nearly silent. The Ford's sonar might not detect them until it's too late. They're cheap. A Type 209 costs about $300 million. A Ford costs $13 billion. That's a 43-to-1 cost ratio. Even if the U.S. sinks 10 subs for every carrier it loses, it's still a losing proposition. They're expendable. If Venezuela loses a sub, it's a setback. If the U.S. loses a carrier, it's a catastrophe. The escalation risk. Here's where it gets dangerous. The U.S. has a first strike mentality. If a Venezuelan sub gets too close, the Pentagon's instinct is to shoot first, ask questions later. But in the age of gray zone warfare, that's a recipe for disaster. What if the sub was carrying a nuclear-tipped torpedo? What if the sub was a decoy, and the real threat was a Russian Yazan lurking nearby? What if China or Iran decides to test U.S. resolve next? The U.S. can't afford to escalate, but it also can't afford to not escalate. That's the paradox of modern deterrence. Lessons from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. The U.S. has a habit of underestimating its adversaries. In Iraq, it thought Saddam Hussein's army would collapse in weeks. In Afghanistan, it thought the Taliban would be defeated in months. In Libya, it thought Gaddafi would fall without a fight. But Venezuela isn't Iraq, Afghanistan, or Libya. It's a proxy for Russia, China, and Iran. And those three countries have nuclear weapons. If the U.S. starts sinking Venezuelan subs, it's not just fighting Maduro, it's risking a direct confrontation with Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. The domestic political why this is about more than just Venezuela. Let's be U.S. foreign policy isn't made in a vacuum. It's shaped by domestic politics, elections, voter sentiment, and the whims of the political class. The 2024 election hangover. The Biden administration is still reeling from the 2024 election, where foreign policy was a major liability. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Ukraine war stalemate, and the rising tensions with China all hurt the Democrats. Now, with 2026 midterms looming, the White House is desperate to avoid another foreign policy disaster. That's why the Ford was sent to Venezuela in the first place. It was a show of strength, a way to reassure voters that America is still in charge. But when the Venezuelan sub got too close, the administration faced Option 1, escalate and risk a wider conflict. Option 2, back down and look weak. They chose Option 2. And that tells you everything you need to know about U.S. foreign policy. It's driven by politics, not strategy. The role of key players. Secretary of State Antony wants to avoid a crisis, but also doesn't want to be seen as soft on Russia. National Security Advisor Jake pushing for a diplomatic off-ramp, but facing resistance from the Pentagon. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Charles Q. wants to respond forcefully, but knows the U.S. can't afford another war. CIA Director William warning that Russia is deliberately provoking the U.S. to test its resolve. The result? A muddled response, one that satisfies no one. Swing states and the strong America narrative. Here's the dirty little foreign policy is domestic policy. The Ford's deployment wasn't just about Venezuela, it was about Florida. Florida is a swing state with a large Venezuelan American population. Many of them fled Maduro's regime and want the U.S. to take a harder line. The Biden administration is trying to win their votes by looking tough, but not too tough. If the U.S. sinks a Venezuelan sub, it risks alienating the anti-interventionist left. If it does nothing, it risks losing Florida to the Republicans in 2026. That's the real reason the Ford was there and why the U.S. backed down. Scenario: what happens next? So where do we go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. The U.S. and Russia reach a de facto Venezuela is off limits for direct confrontation. The Ford leaves the Caribbean. Russia stops supplying Venezuela with advanced weapons. Maduro, realizing he's on his own, cuts a deal with the U.S. to ease sanctions in exchange for limited political concessions, maybe even a staged election in 2025 that Washington can spin as free and fair. The Venezuelan military, seeing the writing on the wall, quietly sidelines Maduro in favor of a more pliable general. The Ford sails home to Norfolk, mission accomplished, and the Biden administration declares victory without firing a shot. The media moves on to the next crisis, and the whole episode fades into the background noise of 21st century great power competition. But let's be honest, this is the scenario that exists only in the minds of think tank white papers and State Department talking points. The problem with best-case outcomes is that they require all parties to act rationally, and in geopolitics, rationality is often the first casualty. Maduro isn't a rational actor in the traditional sense, he's a survivor, and his survival depends on keeping the military loyal and keeping the Russians engaged. The moment he looks like he's cutting a deal with Washington, he risks a coup from within or abandonment from Moscow. And the Russians? They're not in Venezuela out of altruism. They're there because it's a low-cost, high-reward way to poke the U.S. in its own backyard. Why would they walk away from that just because the Ford left the Caribbean? Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader erosion of U.S. deterrence in the Western Hemisphere, a region Washington has treated as its exclusive sphere of influence since the Monroe Doctrine. The uncomfortable truth is that the U.S. has been losing ground in its own neighborhood for years, and the Ford incident is just the latest symptom of that decline. Let me explain why this matters. In 2008, Russia sent a naval task force to the Caribbean for the first time since the Cold War. In 2013, it signed a military cooperation agreement with Nicaragua, giving it access to ports and airfields. In 2019, it deployed nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela. And in 2023, it began supplying Maduro with advanced anti-ship missiles and submarines, exactly the kind that nearly forced the Ford into a corner. Meanwhile, China has been quietly exiting its economic and military footprint in the region, from deepwater ports in AMA to satellite tracking stations in Argentina. The U.S. hasn't faced a peer competitor in its own hemisphere since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's clear that the old rules no longer apply. Here's the US still has overwhelming military superiority in the region, but superiority doesn't matter if you're not willing to use it. And that's the real problem. The Ford incident exposed a fundamental contradiction in US strategy. On one hand, Washington wants to project strength and deter adversaries. On the other, it's unwilling to risk the political and economic costs of actually enforcing its red lines. This isn't a new dilemma, it's the same one that plagued the Obama administration in Syria, the Trump administration in Iran, and now the Biden administration in Venezuela. The difference is that in the past, the US could afford to muddle through. Today, with Russia and China actively challenging US dominance, muddling through is no longer an option. Let's talk about the military implications, because this is where things get really interesting. The Ford incident wasn't just a diplomatic embarrassment, it was a wake-up call for the US Navy. For decades, the Navy has operated under the assumption that it can project power anywhere in the world with impunity. But the rise of asymmetric threats, cheap, expendable weapons like diesel-electric submarines, anti-ship missiles, and drones has made that assumption dangerously outdated. The Ford is the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world, but it's also a $13 billion sitting duck if it gets too close to an adversary's coastline. And that's exactly what the Russians and Chinese are counting on. The Venezuelan sub that got too close to the Ford wasn't some rogue operation. It was a calculated move, designed to test US responses and gather intelligence. The sub in question was likely a Russian-supplied Kilo-class, a diesel-electric boat that's quiet, deadly, and nearly impossible to detect in shallow waters. The Russians have been training the Venezuelan Navy to operate these subs for years, and the Ford incident suggests they're getting good at it. The fact that the sub got within torpedo range before being detected is a nightmare scenario for the US Navy and a sign of things to come. Here's why the US Navy is still structured for the 20th century, not the 21st. It's built around massive, expensive platforms like aircraft carriers and destroyers, which are vulnerable to precisely the kinds of asymmetric threats that Russia and China are perfecting. The Ford incident should have been a Sputnik moment for the Navy, a wake-up call that the old way of doing business is no longer tenable. But instead of adapting, the Navy is doubling down on its existing strategy, betting that technology and firepower will be enough to deter adversaries. That's a dangerous gamble, and one that could backfire spectacularly in a real crisis. The broader geopolitical context here is even more concerning. The Ford incident didn't happen in a vacuum, it's part of a larger pattern of Russian and Chinese aggression that's testing US resolve across multiple theaters. In the South China Sea, China is building artificial islands and militarizing them, daring the US to respond. In the Black Sea, Russia is using its navy to blockade Ukraine and threaten NATO allies. And in the Arctic, both Russia and China are extending their military presence, challenging US dominance in a region that was once considered a backwater. The Ford incident is just the latest example of this trend, and it's a sign that the US is being stretched thin. So where does this leave us? The uncomfortable truth is that the US is facing a crisis of deterrence, and the Ford incident is just the tip of the iceberg. The Biden administration's response, or lack thereof, has sent a clear message to the US as unwilling to risk escalation, even when its core interests are threatened. That's a dangerous precedent, and one that could embolden Russia and China to push even harder in the coming years. Now, let's game out what happens if the US doesn't change course. Scenario 2, the slow erosion of US influence. In this scenario, the Ford incident becomes the new normal. Russia and China continue to extend their presence in the Western Hemisphere, using Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba as forward operating bases. The US responds with half-measures, sanctions, diplomatic protests, the occasional freedom of navigation operation, but nothing that actually changes the calculus on the ground. Over time, US allies in the region start hedging their bets, turning to Russia and China for investment and security guarantees. The Monroe Doctrine becomes a relic of the past, and the US finds itself on the defensive in its own backyard. This isn't some far-fetched dystopian fantasy, it's already happening. In 2022, Honduras switched diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China, following the lead of Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic. In 2023, Argentina signed a $2.7 billion currency swap deal with China, giving Beijing a foothold in the country's economy. And in 2024, Russia announced plans to open a new military base in Nicaragua, just 500 miles from the US border. These aren't isolated incidents, they're part of a deliberate strategy to chip away at US influence in the region. The real danger here isn't just that the US loses influence, it's that it loses control. The Western Hemisphere has been a strategic backwater for the US for decades, but that's changing. With Russia and China extending their presence, the region is becoming a new front in the great power competition. And if the US doesn't wake up to that reality, it could find itself facing a crisis far worse than the Ford incident. Imagine, for example, a scenario where Russia deploys nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela, or where China establishes a military base in Cuba. These aren't hypotheticals, they're real possibilities, and they're exactly what the US should be preparing for. So what's the alternative? Scenario 3, the US draws a line in the sand. In this scenario, the Biden administration, or its successor, decides that enough is enough. The US imposes a naval blockade on Venezuela, cutting off its oil exports and choking its economy. It deploys additional forces to the region, including submarines and long-range bombers, to deter further Russian and Chinese aggression. And it makes it clear that any attack on US forces will be met with overwhelming retaliation. This isn't about starting a war, it's about re-establishing deterrence and making it clear that the US won't tolerate foreign powers operating with impunity in its backyard. The problem with this scenario is that it requires political will, and right now, the US doesn't have it. The Biden administration is already facing pushback from the left over its support for Ukraine, and the idea of escalating tensions with Russia in Venezuela is a non-starter for many Democrats. Meanwhile, the Republicans are more interested in scoring political points than in crafting a coherent strategy. The result is paralysis, a situation where the US is neither willing to back down nor willing to fight. Here's the bottom: the Ford incident was a warning, and the US ignored it. The question now is whether it will learn from its mistakes or continue sleepwalking into a crisis. The stakes couldn't be higher. If the US doesn't act soon, it could find itself facing a new Cold War in its own hemisphere, one it's ill-prepared to win. And that's a scenario no one should want to see. Now, what most people don't realize is that this paralysis isn't just a product of the current administration's weaknesses, it's a symptom of a much deeper rot in Washington's foreign policy establishment. The US hasn't had a coherent grand strategy since the end of the Cold War, and the last 2 decades of endless wars in the Middle East have left the American public and its political class exhausted, divided, and deeply skeptical of any military engagement that doesn't involve an immediate, visceral threat. The problem isn't just Biden or Trump or any single president, it's that the entire system is designed to react, not to anticipate. And when you're always reacting, you're always one step behind. Let me explain why this matters in the context of Venezuela. The Ford incident wasn't just a close call, it was a test. Not just of US naval readiness, but of US political resolve. And the fact that the White House's response was a mix of muted condemnation and behind the. Here's the uncomfortable: it won't. Venezuela isn't some isolated crisis, it's a pressure point in a much larger struggle for influence in Latin America, and the US is losing ground. Let's look at the numbers. In 2000, the US accounted for 55% of Latin America's trade. By 2022, that number had fallen to 32%. Meanwhile, China's share has surged from 2% to 18% over the same period. Russia, for its part, has been steadily increasing its arms sales to the region, with Venezuela alone accounting for over $11 billion in Russian military exports since 2005. And while the US has been distracted by wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, China has been quietly building ports, railroads, and 5G networks across the hemisphere, infrastructure that could easily be repurposed for military use if the need arises. So what happens when the next Ford incident occurs, and this time, the Venezuelan sub isn't just harassing a carrier but actually sinks a US warship? The domestic political fallout would be immediate and brutal. Imagine the US Navy ship sunk in Caribbean, Biden's weakness to blame. The Republicans would have a field day, framing it as the ultimate humiliation, a Pearl Harbor for the 21st century. The left, meanwhile, would be torn between condemning the attack and opposing any military response. The result? A fractured political class, a divided public, and an administration forced to choose between looking weak and risking a wider war. Let's game this out. Scenario A, the US responds with a limited strike, perhaps taking out a Venezuelan naval base or a Russian-supplied radar installation. The problem here is that Venezuela isn't Iraq or Syria, it's a client state of two nuclear-armed powers. Any attack on Venezuelan soil risks escalation with Russia or China, neither of which has any interest in backing down. Russia, in particular, has shown a willingness to escalate in Ukraine, and there's no reason to think it wouldn't do the same in Venezuela. The last thing the US needs is a proxy war with Russia in its own backyard. Scenario B, the US does nothing. This is the more likely outcome, at least initially. The Biden administration would issue a strongly worded statement, impose new sanctions, and maybe send a few more warships to the region. But sanctions have done little to weaken Maduro's regime. If anything, they've strengthened his grip on power by giving him an external enemy to rally against. And as for the naval deployments, they'd be seen as empty posturing, a repeat of the Ford incident but with even less credibility. The message to Moscow and Beijing would be the US is a paper tiger, and its red lines aren't worth respecting. Here's where things get really dangerous. If the US doesn't respond decisively to an attack on one of its ships, it sets a precedent that could embolden other adversaries. Iran, for example, has been testing US resolve in the Persian Gulf for years. If Tehran sees that Washington won't retaliate against Venezuela, it might decide to escalate its own harassment of US ships. The same goes for China in the South China Sea. Deterrence isn't just about having the biggest military, it's about convincing your adversaries that you're willing to use it. And right now, the US is failing that test. The domestic political dimensions of this are just as fraught. The American public is deeply divided on foreign policy, and that division is only getting worse. A 2023 Pew Research poll found that 45% of Americans believe the US should mind its own business internationally, up from 30% in 2002. Meanwhile, a growing number of Republicans, led by figures like Tucker Carlson and J.D. Vance, are openly questioning the value of US alliances and military commitments abroad. The left, for its part, is increasingly skeptical of military interventions, with even mainstream Democrats like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren calling for a reduction in defense spending. This isn't just a partisan issue, it's a generational one. Younger Americans, who came of age during the failures of Iraq and Afghanistan, are far less likely to support military action abroad than their parents or grandparents. A 2022 Chicago Council on Global Affairs survey found that only 39% of Americans under 30 support using military force to defend Taiwan, compared to 62% of those over 60. If the US were to get into a shooting war with Venezuela, the political backlash would be swift and severe, particularly among younger voters who are already disillusioned with the establishment. So where does that leave us? The US is caught between a rock and a hard place, with no good options and a political class that's more interested in scoring points than solving problems. The Ford incident was a wake-up call, but Washington hit the snooze button. The next time, the alarm might not be so easy to ignore. And if the US isn't prepared, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for Venezuela, but for the entire hemisphere. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the unraveling of America's grand strategy in the 21st century. For decades, the US has operated under the assumption that its military dominance is so overwhelming that no rational actor would dare challenge it directly. That assumption is now being tested in real time, and the results aren't pretty. The Ford incident wasn't an anomaly, it was a symptom of a much deeper the erosion of deterrence in an era of proliferating gray zone tactics, where adversaries can probe and harass without crossing the threshold of outright war. Let me explain why this matters. The US Navy's carrier strike groups are the crown jewels of American power projection. They're designed to intimidate, to signal resolve, and to dominate any theater of operations. But what happens when that intimidation factor starts to fade? What happens when a third-rate power like Venezuela, with a GDP smaller than that of Connecticut, starts acting like it can push around the world's sole superpower? The answer isn't just about Venezuela. It's about China watching closely in the South China Sea, Iran in the Persian Gulf, and even Russia in the Arctic. If the US can't deter a country with a collapsing economy and a military that still relies on Soviet-era equipment, what does that say about its ability to deter Beijing or Moscow? Here's the uncomfortable: the US is still operating under a Cold War playbook that assumes adversaries will play by the same rules. But the rules have changed. Venezuela isn't trying to sink the Ford, it's trying to humiliate it, to make the US look weak, to erode public confidence in American power. And it's working. Every time a Venezuelan sub or patrol boat gets too close, every time the US blinks and doesn't respond with overwhelming force, it sends America's red lines aren't real. That's a dangerous precedent, and it's one that will be exploited again and again. So what are the alternatives? The establishment in Washington would have you believe there are only two: either escalate to the point of war or accept humiliation. But that's a false choice, and it's one that betrays a lack of imagination. The US has other tools at its disposal, tools that don't involve sending the Marines into Caracas but still impose real costs on the Maduro regime. For starters, there's economic warfare. Venezuela's economy is already on life support, but the US could tighten the screws further. Right now, the Trump-era sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector are still in place, but they're being enforced inconsistently. The Biden administration has granted waivers to allow limited oil exports to Europe, ostensibly to stabilize global energy markets. That's a mistake. If the US wants to send a message, it should cut off those waivers entirely and threaten secondary sanctions on any country that buys Venezuelan oil. That would hit Maduro where it hurts, his wallet, and force him to choose between his survival and his defiance of the US. Then there's the diplomatic front. The US has spent years trying to isolate Venezuela, but it hasn't done enough to peel away Maduro's few remaining allies. Russia and China are the obvious ones, but even countries like Turkey and India have been willing to do business with Caracas. The US could offer incentives, trade deals, debt relief, or even security guarantees to countries that distance themselves from Maduro. It's not about regime change, it's about making it clear that there's a cost to being Venezuela's patron. And let's not forget the military options that don't involve full-scale war. The US could, for example, impose a naval blockade on Venezuelan ports, intercepting ships carrying military equipment from Russia or Iran. It could also step up its support for Colombia, which has its own tensions with Venezuela, or even work with Brazil to create a regional security framework that isolates Caracas. None of these options are risk-free, but they're far less risky than allowing Venezuela to keep poking the US with impunity. The bigger question, though, is whether the US has the political will to do any of this. The American public is tired of foreign entanglements, and the political class is too divided to agree on a coherent strategy. That's a recipe for drift, and drift is the most dangerous policy of all. If the US doesn't act decisively now, it will find itself in a position where it has no good options left, where the only choices are surrender or war. I've spent my career studying how great powers decline, and one of the most consistent patterns is that they don't fall because of a single catastrophic defeat. They fall because they lose the ability to make hard choices, because they allow their adversaries to chip away at their dominance one small provocation at a time. That's where the US is headed if it doesn't wake up. Venezuela is a test case, but it's not the only one. The real question is whether America still has the stomach for the kind of sustained, strategic pressure that keeps adversaries in check. The Ford incident should have been a wake-up call. Instead, it was just another data point in a trend that's been building for years. The next time a Venezuelan sub gets too close, the US might not be so lucky. And if that happens, the consequences won't just be regional, they'll be global. Because in the end, deterrence isn't just about what you can do. It's about what your adversaries think you will do. And right now, they don't think the US will do much of anything at all.